Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I will be ranking the albums by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. It seems like quite a long time ago now, probably 3 or 4 years ago, when we were stuck in our houses in COVID. I was a bit bored and I decided to do a ranking video for my own entertainment of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I put that video up online, and then a few months later, I noticed it had thousands of views. Oh, that's interesting. So I did another one. This ranking video was the beginning of this channel. Who would have known that it would have grown into something so wonderful and beneficial to mankind? But it has. Now I have, because of that video and a whole bunch of support from my patrons and my viewers, I am now in this lovely new YouTubing studio, and I thought I want to revisit this. And then the next thing I thought, shall I go with the ranking that I had 3 or 4 years ago? And I thought no, because I've learned stuff doing this. So I started from scratch, and this is a different order, and I actually think this is much more objective. I think I had to learn how to become objective when it came to ranking videos. I think the original one I did was a little bit more just my taste. So I think this one is more objective. I'm much happier with this one. So for those of you who don't know, the Mahavishnu Orchestra was formed in 1971 by the Yorkshire-born guitarist John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin had emerged in London as part of the sort of music scene that was burgeoning there in the early 60s. He was a contemporary of people like Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton. Rather than coming from a sort of blues rock background, he had an interest in classical music. He had an interest in jazz and also Indian music. In 1969, he was invited to go to America by Tony Williams, who was forming a jazz rock fusion band. Now, jazz rock had only just started to stick its little shoots of brilliance up into the world at this point. And he went to America, he went to New York in 1969, and he formed the Tony Williams Lifetime, one of the most important seminal birthing bands of the jazz rock movement. As soon as he arrived there, he got headhunted by Miles Davis, and then he played on In a Silent Way, which became an absolutely classic album by Miles Davis, probably in the top 3 of his most important albums in music history. And then he went on to play on Bitches Brew and Jack Johnson. This established John McLaughlin as a sort of superstar of guitar. So in 1971, under the sort of suggestion of Miles Davis, he decided to form a band. This band was named by his guru, Sri Chinmoy, because by this point, John McLaughlin's explorations into music had also branched out into the esoteric, and he had become very interested in enlightenment and spiritual matters. And he wanted to form a band that embodied that. And so he went about putting a band together. The band he put together in 1971 featured Billy Cobham, who had also played on Jack Johnson with him in the Miles Davis band. Rick Laird, who was a contemporary of his from the London scene in the early 60s. He pulled in Jerry Goodman, who was not a jazz musician. He was a classically trained violinist who had also an interest in psychedelic rock. And he played the electric violin a little bit like Jimi Hendrix, but had the chops to be able to understand the incredible charts that John McLaughlin was writing at that time. And then on keyboards, electric piano initially, and then on Moog synthesizer, he brought in Jan Hammer, another young musician that had come from Czechoslovakia, an absolute genius, had landed the gig with Sarah Vaughan, and then went on to form the Mahavishnu Orchestra. In 1971, they went into the studio and they made the seminal album In a Mountain Flame, which we will obviously be touching on in a little while. That band broke up in 1973, and he reformed the Mahavishnu Orchestra with a much more expanded lineup, bringing out their first album in 1974, Apocalypse. And that band lasted to around about 1976, and then the Mahavishnu Orchestra was over. In the early 80s, he back up with Billy Cobham, and he formed a band with him, which also bears the name Mahavishnu Orchestra, although that music is a lot different to the original Mahavishnu Orchestra. Billy didn't last long, and Dan Gottlieb was brought in from Pat Metheny's band, and there was 2 albums made. Right, so those are the albums I'm going to be looking at today, and I hope that little brief history has filled you in if you're not too sure about the band. But on my channel, there is so many videos about the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and there's a little documentary that really documents their history in a much more, well, it says a brief history of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, but it's less brief than what I just did. So shall we kick on and get straight in to the ranking? And I'm doing this old school. There's no editing on this. This is just me. I've got the records. There's no fancy graphics. We're just in the room and we're going. I haven't planned it. I don't know what I'm going to say. That's my style. That's how we go. Right. So right at number 9, I've got 9 albums here. And number 9, I have the very last album, the second album from the 80s incarnation of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And it's called Adventures in Radioland. I bought this when it came out, so I have the original cover here. They've since changed the cover. I'm not too sure why. I don't know if it's because of these kids. There's the rear of it, right? This came out, second album, and it came out on Relativity Records. The lineup on here is John McLaughlin on Gibson Les Paul Special, Mike Padula guitar, which is controlling a synclavier. So he's got guitar synthesis on here and also an acoustic guitar. We've got the incredible Bill Evans from Miles Davis's band on saxophone, Mitchell Foreman on keyboards, Jonas Hellborg on wall double neck bass, that's fretless and fretted, and as I said, from the Pat Metheny group, Dan Gottlieb. Right, this is an okay album. We've got to remember that, you know, by the 1980s, jazz rock and jazz fusion was suffering from a little bit of what I call fusac. It had all was they were trying to sell, you know, chase the records. Now, in the early 70s, jazz rock sold a lot of albums, and those musicians were able to make some incredible music. Bands like Return to Forever and Weather Report and 11th House and Stanley Clarke, Al Di Meola. Some of these artists sold millions of albums, and that is down to this band. It's down to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I think when they came back together, and here it's actually, we've got John McLaughlin and Mahavishnu. So the label is actually focusing on John. Now, say if this wasn't called, Mahavishnu, and they decided to call the band I might be perceiving this in a different way, and this might be like a good album from the 80s from John McLaughlin. But we are comparing it to the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and the first thing is it doesn't sound like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The elements that make Mahavishnu, the sort of dark, twisting, emotionally wrenching music, is not so much on here. What this is a sort of, I would say, a little bit more middle of the road Fusac approach to jazz rock. It's a little bit heavier. John's playing more electric guitar on here than the album that came before it that was simply called Mahavishnu. And this album is often liked more than the other album. And I think that's because it's got some brutally fast guitar playing by John and a lot less in clavier playing. But here they are on Relativity Records. The album before it's on Warner Brothers. I felt the production values go down. I'm missing Billy Cobham. Dan Gottlieb does a brilliant job, but he's not Billy Cobham for me. I don't feel the compositions are quite as strong. And I feel that the band is almost like spiraling out of energy, which is why we never saw any more after this. It's a good album, but if you're interested in the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you would never start with this. It's going to let you down, okay? At number 8, I have the album that precedes that, which is this one, Mahavishnu. And there is the rear cover. So what can I say about this one? Why have I put it above the other one? Well, this one's on Warner Brothers. It's got Billy Cobham on drums. And I feel that the production and the compositions are stronger. The reason why people have a problem with this is that when you put it on, unless you really know John's approach to soloing, it's hard to tell what he's doing against what the keyboardist is doing. For me, who knows his approach and the sort of note selection, it's quite obvious. And I find that compelling because I know John's playing and I can transfer that in. But I think for a lot of people, they will listen to this and go, what am I listening to? It's actually very Weather Report. The album that came after this, Adventures in Radioland, suffers also with a lot of sort of DX7s and gated reverb and all that sort of horrible 80s production This drum sound is a lot tighter. Billy plays amazing on here. Radioactivity is fantastic. There's a track called Night Riders where it's the only one where he pulls the electric guitar out and he really blazes, sounding almost like a metal guitarist on that. East Side, West Side, Clarendon Hills, more Fuzaki. There is also a tune on here which is called When Blue Turns to Gold and features Katia Lebec on piano, and also Hari Prasad Chausaria and Zakir Hussain as well. So we've got two Indian classical musicians, including Zakir Hussain from his band Shakti that came in after the second Mahavishnu Orchestra, and that also elevates it up. Pacific Express is better. This is a better album. I don't care what anyone says, it's just a better album. I think what messed this album up is that he got back together with Billy Cobham, and then I don't think there was either confusion or John wanted to move on. And Billy was left high and dry. He just went and got another drummer. Billy was expected to do the dates. So I think there was some bad feeling that I don't think was really patched up until they got back on stage at Montreux Jazz Festival back in 2011. Jonas Hellborg's incredible on here. And before this, what preceded this, they were touring with a trio, which was just Billy, Jonas and John McLaughlin. There's some video up on YouTube of that band, and it's very fiery. And that's the one thing I would have just loved to hear, the power trio of those three in a room just burning. So that is what I've got at number, what was it, 8. Right, so as I said, if you think of the Mahavishnu Orchestra in 3 phases, the classic Mahavishnu Orchestra with Billy Cobham, and then the upscaled Mahavishnu Orchestra, which came out in 1974, that has Narada Michael Walden on drums. And they made 3 albums, and then the 80s Mahavishnu Orchestra, which we have covered. Well, the album I've got up next is the third of the second incarnation, the Narada Michael Walden band, and it is this one here. Now, I have often found this a very troublesome album. The 2 albums that precede this one have an expanded lineup. There's a string quartet on there, there's brass on there, there's vocals on there. This comes down to just a quartet, and the quartet is, of course, John McLaughlin on guitar, and also a little bit of very early guitar synthesizer. God knows how they got this thing working in 1976. And then we got the incredible Ralph Armstrong on bass, one of the greatest bass players of the 1970s, an absolute pioneer. We've got Stu Goldberg on keyboard, an absolute virtuoso who was more than able to do that sort of Jan Hammer Moog soloing. He wasn't in the band that preceded this, and I often felt that you did slightly miss that Jan Hammer sound in the band that goes before this. And then we have, of course, Narada Michael Walden on drums. Now, this album was recorded out in France at the Chateau, what's it called? Can I find this? It's the chateau where Elton John recorded Honky Tonk Chateau. So they're really at the peak of their game. They've sold a lot of records, and the record company that can now fund them to go into this great big studio, residential studio in France, and let them sit there for a month or whatever. A big contrast to the first album that had to be made in 2 days flat. Does that really make a great album? This is a little bit unfocused, right? If you really sit down and listen to it, firstly, that Mahavishnu sound that we love, that is on the first few albums, that dark, spiritually, explosive sound has diminished. This is a lot funkier. It has sort of almost like a sound of Santana in certain places. It's got vocals on it. All this is fine. It's all great, but it doesn't sound like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The sound has changed. When you look at the compositions on here, there's a lot less by John McLaughlin. And the ones that are by John are almost like jams. All in the Family, it sounds like a jam, whereas Planetary Citizen, Inner Worlds Part 1 and 2, The Way of the Pilgrim are all written by the other people in the band. River of My Heart. We do have an early version of Lotus Feet on here, which is lovely. That's absolutely brilliant. This is a great album, but I think in a way it's more of a band album, and John settles back a little bit. His guitar sound and soloing is pretty explosive, and I've never known what to make of it, to be honest. There's certain solos on here where he to me, he almost seems like he's losing his weight. And also, there is one track on here that divides the Mahavishnu audience. Some absolutely love it and some hate it. I love it. There's a track called Miles Out, which is sort of a psychedelic 70s guitar effects drenched version of the interplay that you would used to get between Coltrane and Elvin Jones. It's unbelievable. Narada Michael Walden is off the scale on drums on this, and his drum sound is absolutely incredible. This is a good album. Coming back to rank these albums, the big problem you have is the Mahavishnu Orchestra on the first album emerges fully formed, and it changes jazz and it changes rock music. And so everything after that we are comparing to that initial burst. And of course, those albums are going to be on the top of this list. The first incarnation of the Mahavishnu Orchestra made 2 albums. The first one's called In a Mountain Flame, and the follow-up to that was called Birds of Fire. They were doing a lot of touring, they were getting burnt out, and also there was arguments emerging over composer credit. Nobody expected this band to sell in the numbers it did. These albums weren't like jazz albums selling 10 or 20,000 copies. These albums were going into the Billboard top 20, and they were filling out large venues with thousands of people. So after Birds of Fire, cracks start to appear, and there is a big falling out, and then that is the Mahavishnu Orchestra over. I've gone into more detail about that. I'm not going to say much more about it here. Okay. So they did do one more album, which is the live album Between Nothingness and Eternity. And that album's interesting because although it's a live album, the 3 tracks that are on there were all new compositions. And those compositions had been written for another album, which they went into the studio in London, into Trident Studios, and they started work on a 3rd album, and it was so tense that I think John McLaughlin eventually led some of the sessions in tears, and it was abandoned. Around about 1999, I think, 1999, they actually found a mix of this album. This album had become known as the Lost Trident Sessions, and this mix was very, very good. And I think it was by Ken Scott, I imagine, although I can't see that on the back. And in 1999, they brought this album out. This was a very big event for us Mahavishnu Orchestra fans, I tell you, because it was suddenly like finding a 3rd studio album. When I initially listened to it again, I realised now that my perception of it was based upon the fact that I knew this was unfinished. And at the time, I was listening to it, really analysing it and going, what would they have done more? Because I think John at the time wanted to expand the band out and bring like almost like an orchestra in or a string quartet, which he does with the next band. And so for me, when I listen to it, it all sounds a little bit emptier than the sound we get on Birds of Fire and In a Mountain Flame, as though John was arranging stuff to have these other elements come in. I put this one on in the car when I was driving over to my studio this morning to try and re-gauge it. And this time, when the opening track Dream started up, I just thought, this is a Mahavishnu Orchestra album. This is an actual Mahavishnu Orchestra album. I am so close to this band, it's hard for me to judge. Anyway, on here we have Dream, which is an 11-minute track. That was eventually recorded on Between Nothingness and Eternity and turned into like a 25-minute track. So anybody who knows the live version, the original version, and that's the problem, I'm comparing these studio versions to what I think are the original versions, which are the live versions. And they're much more condensed. And that sort of affects my judgment as well. Then we get Trilogy, which is pretty much the same length as the one on Between Nothingness and Eternity. And then we have Sister Andrea, which is shorter. And the cadenza that John McLaughlin plays on the live album is just one of the greatest guitar moments in the history of guitar. And on here, it's not quite the same. But we do get 3 more tracks. We get I Wonder, And Stepping Tones, I think was written by Jan Hammer, I think. So I should really look at this. Stepping Tones was written by the bass player Rick Laird. And then we've got John's Song. And John's Song is the real highlight. They're just burning on it. John's guitar playing is incredible. And that at the time was the biggest revelation, I think, when this album came out. I'm coming to that with all these sort of preconceptions that I've tried to describe. But that is not why this is relatively low on the list. It is because what we're about to cover now, from now on, are for me some of the greatest albums ever made, right? And so if you want to understand the Mahavishnu Orchestra, from now on, it's all essential. So I think we're on number 5 or number 6, I can't remember. So the next one I've got up is the first album by the Second Incarnation. And this is a masterpiece. And it's an underrated masterpiece. This, for me, is a jump into the future in the same way the initial debut album was. Once the original Mahavishnu Orchestra had imploded, John set about putting a new band together. Now, I think John felt that part of the problem was he had a very specific spiritual message that he was trying to get across with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I think Rick Laird was into it. He was also a very spiritual person. But Jan, Jerry and Billy were coming from another place. So this was filled out in terms of band with a lot of Sri Chinmoy devotees, right? And they're very young as well. The lineup on here is Gail Moran on keyboards and vocals, who then moved on to working with Chick Corea and also eventually marrying Chick Corea. We've got Michael Tilson Thomas, who is conducting the orchestra. This was recorded with the London Symphony Orchestra at Air Studios in 1974. This was one of the first time a band had really played at the same time as an orchestra. So an orchestra is a powerful sound, but it's a big sound and has to be recorded in a big room. But next to a rock band, its volume is infinitesimally small, right? And so it's actually quite hard to put a rock band in with an orchestra. But it's even more difficult when the drummer is Narada Michael Walden, one of the most powerhouse drummers that's ever lived. So John McLaughlin brought in George Martin to oversee the production. Of course, he's the great producer of the Beatles. As well as if we've got Michael Gibbs, who is orchestrating John's compositions for the orchestra. Michael Gibbs goes on to become the sort of arranger and orchestrator for the jazz rock era. We've got Marsha Westbrook on viola. We've got Carol Sheave on violin and vocals. We've got Philip Hershey on cello and vocals. John McLaughlin, of course, on guitar, and he's singing at one point. You've got Narada Michael Walden, or as he's called here, just Michael Walden on drums. And then we got Ralph Armstrong on bass. Now, Gail Moran contributes some incredible vocals on here and some beautiful electric piano playing, but she is not a soloist like Jan Hammer. But we also have on here Jean-Luc Ponty. And Jean-Luc Ponty is one of the few musicians on the planet who I would say is equal to a John McLaughlin in terms of heavyweight improvisation. And so that balance is incredible. And Jean-Luc Ponty is all over this album. This is a real masterpiece. It opens up with an orchestral piece called Power of Love. Very delicate, with just a little bit of the band. And then we move into this track called Vision is a Naked Sword, and that is the main track on side 1. And it charges in with the most deepest, heaviest Mahavishnu sound. You know the sound that I said was missing from the other albums? Here it is embodied and it's orchestral. And it contains perhaps the greatest introduction to a new drummer. It's up there with John Bonham on Good Times, Bad Times. When Narada Michael Walden enters on this album at 20 years old and says, "Here I am," it's just an incredible moment. That track is then followed up with Smile of the Beyond. And the famous story with that was George Martin said to Gail Moran, who was having to sing, remember, in a huge studio, with John McLaughlin and George Martin, Michael Tilson Thomas, and she's singing along with an orchestra. And she put a bit of chewing gum in her mouth, and George said, let's just run it down. But he was sneaky. George Martin was sneaky, and he hit record. So she ran it down, and then she said something like, can we do it properly now? I think I'm ready. And then George turned around and said, no, we've got it. The brilliance of George Martin's production, and he does capture something incredible. Now, remember, George Martin did all those incredible albums in the Beatles, but if you go and read his autobiography or watch any of the documentaries on him, he states this is one of the greatest musical moments in his career. Now, step back and think about that. We have a band, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 albums above this. This is a masterpiece, and it's an underrated masterpiece. And I think it's because this band just could not live up to what the original Mahavishnu Orchestra had done. At number 4, I now have Between Nothingness in Eternity by the original Mahavishnu Orchestra. I've told you a little bit about the story of this, okay? And this album is unbelievable. The playing is off the scale. There's very few bands that write material and then debut the material live. And of course, they'd recorded these albums for the Lost Trident sessions, so that when they were up on stage, they'd probably been playing them live. And so you actually get to hear the compositions when they bedded in with the band. There's a ton of incredible improvisation on this album. This album's very special. For me, when I bought it on vinyl, in fact, this copy, the mix was a bit muddy, and it always put me off this album. I was there trying to hear the bass and the drums. I couldn't quite hear it. If you buy the new CD version, this sounds incredible now. And really, it's just wonderful. It's just that we've got probably the next 3 albums. If I did my 10 favourite albums, these would all be in there. This is also, when it was remastered and remixed for CD release, they delved into the recordings that the Warner Brothers had done, not Warner Brothers, CBS had done for this, and they released another album alongside this, which is called The Unreleased Tracks from Between Nothingness and Eternity. That is an incredibly fine, high-quality recording of the Mahavishnu. And to really understand the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you have to hear them live. But I find that recording, although it's incredible and fiery and it sounds absolutely beautiful, I find it quite troublesome. And I will move on to that in a bit. But let's talk about the rest of this album. Trilogy is an incredible track. Starts off very ethereal and it builds up. And then it drops into this sort of double bass drum charging sound with these heavy riffing in whatever time signature is. I think it's something like 13 or something. I can't remember. We really have the blueprint for sort of thrash metal in this track. Sister Andrea is a Jan Hammer composition. At the time, that would have been the first time anyone had heard on a Mahavishnu Orchestra album a composition by somebody else. Sister Andrea was a composition that Jan had already recorded with Tommy Bolin. You could go and check that out. And what is interesting when you listen to that is a lot of the sound we associate with the Mahavishnu Orchestra in terms of compositionally. Obvious the sound was the summation of these, 5 genius musicians. But in terms of the compositional sound, I think it owes a lot to Jan Hammer. And Jan Hammer's concept of trying to bend the notes to get into the microtonic qualities, but with a keyboard, which he only really completely successfully achieves when he moves to a Moog synthesizer on Birds of Fire. That sound is not only essential to the Mahavishnu Orchestra, but for me, it becomes the signature sound of jazz rock fusion. My point is I think the reason why John McLaughlin never really captured the sound that's on these 3 or 4 early Mahavishnu Orchestra, or shall we say classic Mahavishnu Orchestra albums, is because Jan's sound, Jan's vision was so key to this band. And I think that is partly what created the division in the band, and it was at breaking point at this time. And I can see that John had tried to throw Jan a bone and said, you can put this track on here, and it is incredible. Jan's stuff is a slightly little bit more funky, but what's interesting is the second incarnation of the Mahavishnu Orchestra is also very funky. So I think what we're starting to hear here is the influence of other people in jazz rock that are moving towards the funk. By 1974, of course, you'd had Headhunters come out by Herbie Hancock, and that changed things, and everybody wanted to get funky, and they started to have almost like disco hits. And then I think the music industry, that is where jazz rock, they started to move on. If you study the story of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you really see the beginning and the end of the classic jazz rock era, which is an incredible era for music, when virtuoso musicians were given big budgets to do whatever they want. And it lasted for 5 years, and it lasted from 1971 to 1976. And these albums personify that. On side 2, as I said, we have a much more extended version of Dream. And this is perhaps the most intense recorded Mahavishnu Orchestra, except for one track that we're going to be talking about after I've talked about this. This is an absolutely brilliant album, and I've included in this the unreleased live album. I was going to do that separately, but they actually ended up next to each other, and I can't hold that up because it seems it's only digital. It's up on Spotify. Go and have a listen to it. It's absolutely fantastic. Right, we're going to have a little break now. I'm going to have a little break.
Time traveling Texas, see where it gets us. Time traveling Texas, see where it gets us. Traveling Texas, see where it gets us. Time traveling Texas, see where it gets us. Time traveling Texas, see where it gets us. Time traveling Texas, see where it gets us.
Right, so I'm now going to show you this album. This isn't in the ranking, right? But if I was to put this in the ranking, if you would allow me to put it into the ranking, it would go here at number 4, and that one was number 5 because I got my count wrong. You see, I'm in a nice posh studio, but still, I'm still incompetent at doing this. Sorry, but well, I'll try and keep going. You've seen it now. Anyway, this is the album. This is a double album called Marty Soul, and it's a live recording from what was quite a disastrous music festival out on some island somewhere. It was a little bit like a follow-up to Woodstock. You can see the artists that are on here. We've got the Album Brothers, John Baldry, Cactus, Dr. John, Jonathan Edwards, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Jay Giles Band, B.B. King, and we've got Herbie Mann, Nitsa at Osabisa, right? But we also have on this the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Now, the reason I've held this up is because, like I said, you're not going to understand the Mahavishnu Orchestra unless you hear them live. Now, when I was coming up and there was only the albums to buy, I went searching out the bootlegs, and certain bootlegs became absolutely legendary. I managed to get a copy of Wild Strings, which is a very high quality bootleg and gives you a brilliant idea of what the Mahavishnu Orchestra sounded like live. Now, there is so much out there, and they are also releasing loads of albums that will say, you know, Mahavishnu Orchestra in Chicago and Mahavishnu Orchestra in Cleveland with like psychedelic covers, and you may think they're proper albums. They're not. They're bootleg albums, and they vary in quality. Some of them are very good. Some of them, often when they're radio broadcasts, some of them are not so good, right? Now, when the Mahavishnu Orchestra get together, it's like a bomb going off. And in the beginning of their sort of live performance career, what is jaw-dropping is the cohesiveness of the band, the interplay. This is like almost like one unit, thinking as one. And they seem to emerge like this. Now, I think the reason for this is because when John McLaughlin first formed the Mahavishnu Orchestra, it was just him and Billy Cobham, and he would jam through these very complex time signatures with Billy. I've done an interview with Billy Cobham, and it's quite interesting, some of the things he says about the Mahavishnu Orchestra. But I think that was key because they got the drums and the guitar locked, and this band became very rhythmical, and there was an interplay between Billy and John, which retained for the whole of their sort of performing career, where so many tracks would often just drop to drums and guitar, and they would improvise together in that style that John Coltrane used to do with Elvin Jones, right? As time goes on, and the sort of trials and tribulations of the in band fighting and, you know, bad feeling that emerges, if you listen to the live stuff and track it over those 2 years they're playing, more and more you tend to get these solo spots, and that for me is what brings down the unreleased stuff from Between Nothingness and Eternity. By that point, because that is recorded right at the end of their career, and it actually lacks some of the brutal interplay which you hear on the earlier stuff. Okay, so this album was recorded live by Atlantic Records, and so this track on here, which is, they do a version of the Noonwood Race, it's about 15 minutes long. It's properly recorded. It sounds absolutely incredible. And for me, that track on here is the greatest moment of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I really think that's I'm not saying it's their greatest composition. I'm not saying it's my favourite track. But if you want to really hear the Mahavishnu Orchestra at their most brutal, over the top, in your face, spiritually enlightening, but also I'm going to kill everybody in the room, you've got to hear the version of this on here. It's incredible. Now, it took me a long time to find in some second-hand record shop this copy second-hand, and I bought it for £10, which seems pretty cheap to me now. I can remember being very excited when I found this. But if you buy now the CD version of Inner Mountain Flame, it comes with this track. And that is the main reason why my rating has changed. Because at number 3, I have what I would say is my favourite album, not just of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. This is my favourite album. And it is, of course, Visions of the Emerald Beyond. And I have the gatefold here. There we go. Look at that beauty. I absolutely love this album. It's incredibly produced, right? Where John was trying to get an orchestral sound for the band on Apocalypse with the London Symphony Orchestra, here he actually pares it down. But the incredible production of Ken Scott seems to take the string quartet and the brass on here and just expand it out. This is truly the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The tunes on each side bleed into one another. It's like almost like a progressive rock album. This is like one side like epic, but it's not, that because they actually these delineated tracks. Narada Michael Walden, I mean, it's the best drumming ever in the history of mankind on this. Jean-Luc Ponty is just absolutely brutal. Ralph Armstrong is all over the place. And John McLaughlin, in terms of electric guitar, is at his peak. There is not any moment on this with this, but this is the greatest album for me, in terms of my personal taste. So you're probably asking, why is it number 3? And I think it's because these two are so important, and it's the influence. But we'll get to that in a while. It's worth saying that on this album was a track, I think it's called Pegasus. And Pegasus was an improvisation that Jean-Luc Ponty did with an Echoplex in the studio. So it's entirely Jean-Luc Ponty. When this album came out, every track on here was credited to John McLaughlin. And this again created a bit of bad feeling between Jean-Luc Ponty and John McLaughlin, which I think is patched up because, again, more recently, Jean-Luc Ponty has appeared live. You can go and check that out on YouTube with John. And I think that was what caused this band to sort of implode a little bit. But like I said, this is my favourite album of all time. Every single album on this list I have done a whole video on. And so I don't want to, I could be talking about this for 2 hours, but I'm trying to keep this concise. God knows how long this is, this video. I'm trying to keep it concise. So at number 2, what have I got at number 2? I have got at number 2, which I think on my original video I had at number 1. And it is Birds of Fire. Now, Birds of Fire was the first Mahavishnu Orchestra album I ever bought, and that's why it's at number 1 for me. I argued at the time that because you now know what number 1 is, it's In a Mountain Flame. I said In a Mountain Flame has not got the big Billy Com drum kit with the double bass drums on, and it hasn't got a Moog, and so you don't get the full sound of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I think that's a bit extreme now. The real reason this went to number 1 for me is because this is the album that changed my life. Back in around about, I'd say 1982 and 1983, I was having a terrible time. I had almost like a nervous breakdown while I was at school. I had got interested in progressive rock, and I was just starting to get interested in jazz rock. I got to Billy Cobham, and I read about this album. It was mentioned in the back of my friend's instruction manual he'd got about guitar, sort of learned how to play guitar. And at the back there was a list of different guitarists like Eric Clapton, Carlos Santana, with albums to check out. And right at the bottom of the list it said John McLaughlin, the fastest gun in the West, and it said Birds of Fire. And when I read that, I thought, I've got to check this album. And I loved the title. I loved the idea of Birds of Fire. Everything about it fascinated me. I was drawn to it before I even heard it. And so I went down the record shop. It wasn't in the shop. I asked it to order it. It wasn't even been deleted. I went to my school teachers that were old enough to have been around in the early 70s, and they said, oh, my brother might have a copy. Eventually, my mom found it on vinyl, and it's this album that changed my life. And the reason was, it wasn't just the musical attribute, but on the opening track, Birds of Fire, especially when John brings that guitar solo in, he seemed to embody how I felt, but at the same time offer the solution. That's the only way I can describe it. That's the emotional response I had to this music. Anyone who thinks this is just about play flashy and fast, they do not understand. This is an incredible album. The track One Word, which I think should be really called One World, the interplay when they start soloing between themselves at the beginning of that track and it just speeds up, it's one of the great moments of jazz rock fusion. Celestial Terrestrial Commuters is where they come in playing in 1916 time and just basically they just rewrite the book on playing odd times. Every time they've been playing up to 5 and whatever, then they come out playing this insane stuff. Thousand Island Park, which is the acoustic one, which is just piano, guitar, and I think double bass, is absolutely beautiful. Miles Beyond is really funky. Birds of Fire is incredible. And we also have Hope and Resolution, which are these short little tracks that are so intense. Open Country Joy is actually a little bit more fun. And it sort of takes us down this sort of almost like country Americana route to just only explode halfway into a, explosion of jazz rock fusion. And Sanctuary is one of the greatest jazz rock ballads. And it's mournful and intense. And it contains one of the greatest Moog solos of all time, where Jan Hammer pulls emotion out of a keyboard, which I don't think anybody else had done. So this is an utterly masterpiece. I love this album. I love it. But at number 1, I have The Inner Mountain Flame. So why have I put this at number 1? Because I love this album as well. I love them. I do love this album. It's all to do with perception. When I started doing this channel, I didn't realise how subjective I was being. Birds of Fire was like, I can remember coming home from school, my mum had bought a copy of it. It was on the mantelpiece as I walked in. I went, oh my God, it's Birds of Fire. I've been looking at that for a year. And I remember dropping it on and listening to the whole thing with my jaw, looking at the speakers, literally looking at the speakers, going, I can't believe what's coming out of these speakers. I couldn't get this album, but I picked up a CBS best of that came out in the mid-80s. I think they were trying to just consolidate these albums that were deleted. And I bought that album, and that had on it Meeting of the Spirits and Dance of Maya. And those 2 tracks would just blew my mind, right? But I just listened to those. Eventually, when I got this album, because I know those 2 tracks, and they really are the main sort of, well, not the main tracks, but they're so important that I sort of knew what to expect, and it didn't blow me away. But in 1971, anybody buying this album, it just must have taken your head off. This band was the loudest band in the world. CBS gave them 2 days in the studio. They turn up. God knows how they play this incredibly complex music. It's not just complex. John McLaughlin's writing in a style that nobody's ever played in before. I think, who was it? I think it was, it could be Rick Laird, who was friends with the guitarist John Abercrombie, and he took some of the charts over to John Abercrombie and showed him, and John goes, I just don't understand what is even going on here. So it's incredible that they walk into the studio sounding like this. And I think one of the magical things about this album is on the first day they were so loud that the engineer just did not know how to record them. And I think he walked out. And so by the time they got another engineer in, all they could do was go and play it live. They're on fire. It's just a live recording in the studio. Everything sounds like it's about to burst. Billy Cobham is playing a tiny kit, but it sounds like he's destroying the kit. It sounds like when he finished, he stood up and pointed at the kit, went, take it away, put it out of its misery. John McLaughlin's guitar sound, which is a Les Paul, Les Paul through a Marshall, just cranked up to the max, is brutal. Jan Hammer, although we haven't got that Moog sound, he is bending the notes with like frequency shifters, like with effects. He's got the piano open and he's distorting it and overdriving it. It's some of the most, it's the best electric piano anyone's ever made. I don't care. You can love your Herbie Hancocks and your Chick Coreas, but for me, this is the peak of electric piano playing. Jerry Goodman is all over the place. I think Jerry, coming from a rock background and trying to traverse his way through this improvising ensemble, from hell or from heaven, depending on how you see it, he felt like he was trying to keep up. But I think his input was key. He brings the classical element in and the rock element. When I was a kid, I have the Observer Book of Jazz. Here in the UK, we used to have these little books, and if you're into bird watching, you could get the Observer Book of Birds, or the Observer Book of Supercars. And I had the Observer Book of Jazz. And when I flicked through it, there was a picture of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. John McLaughlin was sat there, stood there in white, with his double neck guitar, and in the background was Jerry Goodman looking like a blissed out hippie with the long hair, and I just thought he looked so cool with the violin, and that sold it to me. Jerry's input into this band, all of them, but you shouted, Andy. What are you shouting for? You don't have to shout. I'm getting too worked up by it. I absolutely love this band. All of them are incredible, including Rick Laird. Rick Laird was a master bass player, right? And he is underrated. And a lot of people will turn around and go, Rick Laird, well, he just held it down, and it was like he was really solid, and it was what the band needed. I'm going to tell you something about Rick Laird. He became the house bass player in Ronnie Scott's in London in the 1960s. He played double bass. And he played bass on the album Alfie, I think, by the great Sonny Rollins. And I think he got that session because he had to come in and play for Sonny Rollins. Now, when he tells the story of this, he turns up at Ronnie Scott's. He's never played with the guy before. They're not even playing from charts. There's no real book, right? They're just playing it. And Sonny Rollins is not even introducing what the tunes are, and he's not saying what key he's playing in. And so Rick Laird would have had to listen, pick up what was going on, and then by ear start playing through these jazz standards. That is a musician who is at the top of their game. It doesn't get any better than that. I feel that Rick Laird had an understanding of the bass, which was equal to a Jaco Pastorius or a Stanley Clarke, but he was a bass player. People like Stanley Clarke and Jaco, what they did is they took the bass and then brought it out as a lead instrument. That wasn't Rick's personality, but he played many bass solos. He played a lot of virtuoso stuff, and he played the bass lines to these tracks. So when you go to Birds of Fire and you listen to a One Word, it actually starts off with a bass solo. That's one of my favourite bass solos that anyone's ever done. And the reason why is he's not playing up trying to make it sound like a guitar, or slapping it, trying to make it sound like a drummer. What he's doing is playing a bass solo in the bass end. And if you want to hear how you do that, check that out. This band's an incredible band. When this album came out, it sold reasonably well. It created a scene. Birds of Fire then goes into the top 20. And then John McLaughlin then hooks up with Carlos Santana, records Love, Devotion and Surrender, which is almost like nearly the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And that goes, I think, at number 4 in the charts in America. This album is a very, very important album. Those of you who like progressive rock was changed by this album. Every single progressive rock band changed. King Crimson, Yes, ELP, they all change when this album comes out. This should rightly be at number 1. And for those of you who can go right back to my first video on this channel, when I didn't put this at number 1, and a lot of people chimed in saying, no, Andy, it should be that one at number 1. Yeah, influence-wise, I know you're playing at their most brutal best, and it's got some of their best compositions on. It's got Dancer Maya, which probably personifies the sound of the Mahavishnu more than anything else. And they were right. They were right. So we're 3 years in now into my channel. We're now in this new posh place, and I have just done that again. And I have learned. I have moved on. And I hope you appreciate that this is a living thing, and we can change our opinions. And who knows, in 3 years I might come back again and put Adventures in Radioland at number 1. Who knows? But I have now come to the end of the video. And at the end of the video, I always say, can you like this video? Please put a like on it. I'm telling you to do it now. It won't hurt you at all, but it will help my channel. So stick a like on it. If you like what I'm doing, you want to see some more, and you want to know what I'm going to get up to in here, I've got my drum kit set up, I've got my lights, I've got my recording studio over there. It's all coming in. There's a lot of stuff happening here. Then subscribe and you can follow what I'm doing here. I'm going to change the music industry here. I'm arrogant and big-headed enough to believe I can do it. I think there's another way of talking about music. There's another way of exploring aesthetically what happens with music. and there's a way of reaching out into the world and bringing creative people in and bringing in highly skilled, imaginative listeners. And that's what we have on this channel. We have sophisticated listeners. And so I'm moving towards something here. This building is an old, disused carpet factory, and the charity's taking it over, and they've invited me to come in to do what I'm doing here because they believe in it. And so if you believe in what we're doing here, could you please put a little bit of a donation into the link down below for the Jellyman Heritage Arts Charity to support this place. And once we've got this up and going, you won't have to do it anymore. But I'm really hoping to try and reach out to creative people in the community, and I'll be doing videos about that. I do appreciate that. If you want to support me in what I'm doing, then I have a Patreon, and the link down below is there. You can join as a free member or as a paid member. The paid members obviously get more, but there's still quite a lot of stuff for the free members. So if you enjoy that, then go and check it out. And also I have a PayPal tip jar, which at the moment is saving my life. You know, that little trickle of extra money that's coming in is just keeping my head above water as I try and launch out into the world now as a YouTuber rather than a professional drummer and music teacher, because those worlds are dying in front of us, and I am trying to find another way. And I'm going to try and do my best. And I was joking about being arrogant and big-headed. I don't know whether I can. And I suffer with imposter syndrome trying to do this, and I've done a video on that anyway. I am off on another tangent. If you go back to the original video, when I'm less grey and I've got longer hair, and I'm sat in my garage, there's no heating on, so I think I've got a coat on probably, trying to keep warm. If you go back at that, you will see that never would have I just wittered on at the end of one of my videos like this. But they're the best ones, actually. If you're watching now, you're the best ones, and I love you. I do love you very much. I'm not just saying that to be silly. I do. I love doing this channel. I love the people I've met through it. I love the audience. I love what they put in the comments. They're intelligent. They're creative. It's an incredible place, and I'm so happy to have been able to carve this little oasis of creativity out on the internet. It's not down to me. It's down to the music. It's down to stuff like this. It's the love we all have for albums like this that has brought us all together. I'm chatting to Jean-Luc Ponty at the moment. Whether he'll do an interview, I don't know. He said he should do. Can you believe it? That my love of this band and your love of this band, because you're the one who's got the views, you're the ones who's got us here, has actually now reached out far enough for Jean-Luc Ponty, who when I originally emailed him, said, I'm not interested in doing any interviews. Everyone asks the same questions. You know, I can't be asked. And then when he checked the channel out, he said, oh, I think we're going to have a good conversation. This is incredible stuff, and it's down to you because you're the listeners. Without listeners, there is none of this. So I thank you all very much. This video is actually very important. This video is very important in the history of this channel. It represents something. What? I don't know. But we're here, we've done it, and I am now done. I am going to walk away and switch the camera off now. I have to walk around my table. I can't just reach around. So you'll see me walk in and out of frame. That's the new Andy Edwards style now. Anyway, I'm done. I'm going to get myself a cup of coffee. Thank you all. See you all. And you know what you got to do? Like, subscribe, and do all that stuff. Brilliant. Lovely.